Okay.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I can hear an echo on that. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Carleigh Garcia, and she is the research assistant to the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies in 2019-2020. She is departmental assistant in the English Language and Literacy Department in Mary Immaculate College in Limerick. Carleigh attended Benedictine College in the USA. As part of her studies there, she studied abroad in Florence, and she gained a first-class honours degree. She's won multiple academic awards for her work to date. She's won the Benedictine College's Dean's Scholarship. She has won the Benedictine College's English Department Award, and she won that twice. She's won the Knights of Columbus Scholarship, the Denver Hispanic Advisory Council Award, the Martin Marietta Award, and she has been awarded a Government of Ireland International Education Award in 2018 for the research that she's engaged in. She's a PhD student, and her area of research is on Colm Toibin, the Blackwater Lightship. This is one of the novels that she's looking at, and we're delighted to welcome her and to have her speak today on New Generations, Gay Shame and the Catholic Church. Thank you so much, Carleigh.
Thanks, Trish. All right, so we'll get started. So this novel by Colm Toibin was written in 1999. He is an Irish author, and the book is set in early 1990s Ireland, and it focuses on multiple generations of predominantly female family coming to terms with one of their own, Declan, coming out as homosexual and suddenly dying of AIDS. There is a blending of families, his biological family, and then his chosen gay family consisting of two male friends, Paul and Larry, as they prepare for his death and deal with the animosity, trauma, and shame felt by various members of these families and generations. We will focus on Declan's biological family, that would be his sister Helen, and then his mother, Lily, and the grandmother, Dora, and then that chosen family, Paul and Larry. I'm going to give you some background on the history of gay rights in Ireland. So perhaps not a coincidence, a man named Declan Flynn, like Toibin's protagonist, was attacked and murdered in Dublin by 5 men because of his sexuality. The men were given suspended manslaughter charges for the crime. However, Declan's death led to the first Pride Parade in Dublin in 1983, aiming to highlight the unacceptable violence occurring against homosexuals like Declan. When Trinity lecturer David Norris led the 1861 law criminalizing homosexual acts to the Irish Supreme Court in 1983, his case was defeated on the grounds that homosexual acts were inimical to marriage, morally wrong and harmful to the way of life and to values which the state wished to protect. Colm Toibin had a reaction to this and thought this was out of step with the changing times. So decriminalization of homosexuality in Ireland was not passed until the 24th of June in 1993, with other significant moments for the LGBTQ movement in Ireland not occurring till the passing of Civil Partnership Act in 2005 and then the legalization of gay marriage in 2010. Toibin's Blackwater Lightship takes place, like I said, in the early 1990s Ireland, which was a major time of change in the legislation and persecution of homosexuality, and time where there was also, not coincidentally, a move towards secularization in Ireland. Though Toibin's protagonist's sexuality likely was legal at this point, this does not mean that the prejudice and shame surrounding homosexuality had disappeared overnight in Ireland. There is still a stigma around being gay and contracting AIDS. The Catholic stance on homosexuality can be traced back to the Bible, where St. Paul says that those who behave in homosexual fashion are among those who shall not enter the kingdom of God. Romans and Timothy continue this attitude by pointing to homosexuality as being an example of blindness or disharmony, and the later labels those engaged in this act as sinners. So Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, who was then prefect to Pope John Paul II, and we will now know him as Pope Benedict XVI, delivered the letter to the bishops of the Catholic Church on the pastoral care of homosexual persons, citing the above examples as reasons for the Church's opinion on homosexuality, and stated, Sex can be moral if taken place within marriage, and since marriage is between a man and a woman, acting on homosexuality is immoral, which was a conclusive statement on the church's stance. It is also important to note that at the time of the AIDS outbreak in Ireland, Humanae Vitae, which was an encyclical issued by Pope Paul VI during 1968, governed the church's rejection of all forms of artificial birth control. So this was kind of their sexual stance. There was a moral conflict surrounding HIV and AIDS, and this is because AIDS, once known as GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, comes with a heavy stigma. Did I go past that? Yeah. Connotative baggage, a history of fear, and unfortunately for many, there has long been a confusion and fear surrounding the transfer of HIV and AIDS. Once it was discovered that a person to become HIV positive, they had to be exposed to the virus in a way it could enter the body. So that could be between unprotected sex, contaminated needles, blood transfusions, and mother to baby. The issue becomes moral as well as medical, because for many, especially Christians and specifically Catholics, the belief is that people were to stop having sex, and gay sex and promiscuous heterosexual sex outside of the marital bed, HIV and AIDS would no longer be an epidemic. So Cardinal Hume published a statement in 1987 Ireland stating some people have claimed that the AIDS epidemic is God's punishment of a sinful world. It is better seen as proof of a general law that actions have consequences and that disorder inevitably damages and destroys. During the same year, he continued on to say, AIDS is neither the whole problem nor the central issue. It is a symptom of something deeper and more deadly. AIDS is but one of the many disastrous consequences of promiscuous sexual behavior. Promiscuity is the root cause of the present epidemic. It has always been sinful, but it is rapidly becoming suicidal. Cardinal Hume's argument as representative of the church is that by encouraging the use of condoms and providing clean needles to drug users is simply promoting a lifestyle without morals, and stating that if the danger of AIDS is removed or at least reduced, it is okay to use drugs and have sex outside of marriage. However, Cardinal Hume does encourage the treatment of those with AIDS to be one of compassion despite their sexual actions. The fact that there is an AIDS crisis at all commands that there is a decline in morality throughout Ireland, according to Cardinal Hume. Ireland decided to also launch their own AIDS campaign after Britain, yet there was quite the contrast between the two campaigns. Britain's focus was on educating their people on the way HIV can spread and the proper use of condoms, using phrases that may have offended some, but with the intention that it's better to offend than there to be a lack of education needed to stop the pandemic. While Ireland did not drop leaflets from house to house as Britain did, their campaign did include advertising in newspapers, radios, and on the television. The most revealing difference between the two campaigns would be that Britain named their campaign AIDS, Don't Die of Ignorance, while Ireland's was called One Person, One Partner. The solution Ireland was attempting to promote was clear: monogamy and fidelity would defeat AIDS. Abiding by a Catholic view on sexuality, much of Ireland would believe sex was only for procreational purposes, finding sexual expression is dirty, sinful, and wrong, except when it occurs in marriage and for reproductive purposes. If people were engaging in sex in defiance of this way of thinking, or in even desiring to do so, it is easy to see where shame would reside. In this attitude towards sexuality, the Irish society would find sex outside of marriage to be heinous, including leaving unmarried mothers as stigmatized, homosexual acts, abortion, and divorce illegal. Ireland was not the only Western country to maintain a strict moral code, but it was distinctive in terms of how long this anti-sexual regime was linked to the absence of discourses and conduct that challenged or resisted the dominant obsession with purity. Though the decriminalization of homosexual acts was enacted in England in 1967, Scotland in 1980, Northern Ireland in 1982, and sodomy laws began reform in the USA, first in Illinois in 1961, Ireland did not do so until 1993. When the first case of AIDS was announced in 1982, Ireland still had no mandatory sex education available for youth in school, and contraception was only available by prescription for married couples. Though the church and state were legislatively separated in 1973, Fiona Smith points to the persistence of what she identifies as cultural Catholicism, whereby secular identified subjects subconsciously internalize the doctrine and teachings of the Catholic Church as having negative effects on the HIV awareness and prevention policies. We will now focus on how the culture of Ireland during the 20th century contributed to individual character shame. It was important to get a sense of Ireland's culture surrounding gay rights, the AIDS epidemic, and Catholic foundation. A shame is an affect that is biological in occurrence, but its sources are cultural. The Blackwater Lightship constitutes a reaction against, albeit from within, the Irish status quo, as it illustrates the shame felt by an entire family surrounding the death of their loved one of AIDS and how they are coming to terms with this. Affect theory, founded by Sylvan Tompkins in the 1960s, claims there are 9 affects a person can experience. These can be both positive and negative. Shame humiliation is the affect we will be focusing on. And it's a negative affect because it requires the affect of joy or interest to first be experienced and then partially diminish before shame can be felt. So I have to be invested, interested, or feel joy from something, have that be diminished partially, and then I will feel shame. Shame humiliation is an umbrella term that will be used to cover shame, guilt, and humiliation, with shame being the most severe and important. The Blackwater Lightship has this nice quote by Toibin. Gay writing has a tendency to deal with the tragic and the unfulfilled, whereas Irish writing seems at its most content where there is a dead father or a dead child. The strongest images in Irish fiction, drama, and poetry are brokenness, death, and destruction. The plays are full of shouting, the poetry is full of elegy, the novels are full of funerals. So this kind of gives you a sense of this topic that we're going to head into. The main focus of this chapter of my thesis, looking at the Blackwater Lightship, is to use literary analysis through the lens of affect theory to identify the affects being expressed by Toibin's characters, specifically shame and its sources. One's sexuality is personal. The self is something we are deeply invested in. Sexuality is in general is a topic often mixed with shame and hesitation to speak about, let alone sexuality that is not heteronormative. They were shocked by Larry asking what type of bed their grandmother had when speaking of architectural adjustments to her house, let alone speaking of sex between 2 men. By stating that homosexuality is wrong, stating that someone essentially is, and what is more personal to them than almost anything is wrong, causes shame. Declan, or any person of a non-heterosexual nature, is invested in themselves, in their sexuality by nature, and when told they are sinful, wrong, disgusting, against nature, and yet still feel a slight investment or interest in their natural state of homosexuality, they will feel shame. Shame is not something one can easily hide, as is physiologically shown on one's face. When shame is felt, it appears in the blush of the cheeks, the lowering of the head, or avoiding of eye contact. Kaufman tells us that a person suffering from AIDS is more likely to experience powerlessness with a toxic combination of fear and shame, and part of this is because an AIDS diagnosis is not only a sign of shame, but a source of further humiliation through public revulsion. More than that, many experience an AIDS diagnosis as a sentence of death. Declan's diagnosis left him with the choice of either dying without seeing his family or admitting that he had AIDS, and the conclusion that he was gay to come about from this admission. Declan did not tell the members of his family that he was dying or homosexual until it was almost too late. He avoided his family and he hid from his shame. Even when he is near the end of his life, he sends his friend Paul to tell his sister he is ill with AIDS. Her reaction to this news is described as, quote, her first instinct was to run from the car, to watch for the next traffic lights and try to open the door and run to the pavement, and become the person entering a newsagent's shop and waiting for a bus, become anyone but the person she was now in the car, end quote. She is arguably the most accepting person in the family of Declan's sexuality. Yet her response is one of automatic wish to escape, avoidance and wishing to hide, to become someone else. Paul also hesitates to tell her, perhaps sensing what her reaction would be, and is not straightforward about what Declan's illness is until they are driving to Dublin. Helen's reservations are also made known to us by Toibin when he describes the outfit she wears to visit Declan and eventually to go see her grandmother and relay the news as a nun's costume. After detailing Declan's illness to Helen, Paul states, quote, he's very worried about your mother, and he decided, or I don't know if decided is the word, to leave it until the last minute because he's been avoiding seeing you and your mother, end quote. Paul's response to Helen asking why Declan would not tell them himself, Paul replies, he couldn't face it, drawing attention to the face, which is the window to a person's shame, which is expressed through the face. Otto Fennekel equates, I feel ashamed with I do not want to be seen. Therefore, persons who feel ashamed hide themselves or at least avert their faces. However, they also close their eyes and refuse to look. This is a kind of magical gesture arising from the belief that anyone who does not look cannot be looked at, perpetuating the belief that AIDS is an illness caused by promiscuity as well as homosexuality. Helen asks if Declan has a boyfriend. Declan, rather than facing his mother and grandmother himself, albeit being in the hospital, sends Helen to tell them the news. When Helen tells Paul that her main focus is letting her mother know about the shocking information, he tells her that, quote, the main thing is Declan, not your mother, end quote, shaming her for even believing that her mother's shame and feelings have a place before Declan's, who is the one in actual pain. When thinking about telling them, she feels, quote, mostly when she is worried or was concerned, it was about things which could be solved or would pass, but this was something new for her, and that was why, she believed, her mind kept avoiding it, something that would not go away, that could only get worse. She would do anything, she realized, to wish it away, end quote. In a way of avoiding telling her mother, an act of shame in itself, she goes to her grandmother's house first. This is an interesting route to take. Though her grandmother is further removed from the situation by not being Declan's closest relative, his mother, she is from an older generation, which one would assume would attach more stigma to homosexuality and favor Catholic beliefs. At times, it seems as if Toibin is giving us clues on which characters believe they are the most modern, as if that makes them more tolerant. As we will see, it does not always correlate. Though Helen informs us at times that she was on the pill in college, wants to pray but cannot, and avoids going to communion or wearing a head covering during Mass, at moments her intolerance shines through. We soon learn that Dora, their grandmother, is a modern woman, despite her age, who, quote, had access to all the English channels as well as the Irish ones. She watched documentaries and late-night films and prided herself on being well-informed on modern subjects. She knew about AIDS and the search for a cure and the long illnesses. There's nothing that can be done, Helen, so, she said. Nothing can be done. It was the same with your father's cancer. There was nothing the doctors could do, and poor Declan's only just starting his life, end quote. And Helen's flashback to her childhood, she remembers her grandmother loving the Late Late Show, and loved having Helen to discuss the guests and controversies in the days that followed. And when women's rights or politics were being discussed, she would bang her fists against the armchair and shout her total agreement with an opinion being expressed. She's right, she's absolutely right, she would roar. Between her love for British television, weekly trips to Wexford, learning to drive with Larry, buying a flick knife to protect herself because she saw it on TV, and claims of, we're all modern now, and I'm as modern as anyone. She is not as modern as she would like to think, and was very religious, superstitious, and opinionated. Her loyalties still lie with her religion, as we are told, quote, she remained silent and tense when religion was discussed, watching some nun or priest or concerned layperson out of the side of her eyes, end quote, and her fervent prayers for Declan's health. She is terrified of her neighbors learning of Declan's illness and who Paul and Larry truly are. Granny is also offensive when she speaks about their sexuality and justifies it with her age, stating, I'm old and I can say what I like, Helen, after relaying that life will always be difficult for homosexuals and that she could tell if a person was gay by the way they walked. When considering AIDS, homosexuality, and shame, it is important to remember that even now, and especially when this was written and set in the 1990s, the reality of AIDS is magnetizing a cultural shame that is still under strict taboo. Shame about sexuality in general, and more specifically about homosexuality, is now being displaced onto AIDS. Declan's grandmother is the perfect example of fear of public revulsion and shame surrounding AIDS. Her grandmother makes her guests lie about who they are to the neighbors to ensure that they do not know Declan is gay or has AIDS. Even worse, when Declan is deathly ill, she refuses to allow Declan to see her own personal doctor so that no one knows the details of his sickness, even though he was bordering on death. Quote, I'll have to draw the line now, and I don't want them to know anything more about me, end quote. When a different doctor finally arrives, quote, Helen realized that she did not want the doctor to know or recognize her, end quote. When they mock the doctor's hair, the grandmother says, quote, oh, stop now about his hair. I'm sure he's saving up to get married, giving good example, which is more than I can say for some of you, end quote. Her obvious disdain for Declan's friends in this scene is not only palpable, but her shame at having anyone in Blackwater, Cush, or the surrounding area know that Declan has AIDS. HIV/AIDS in Irish culture is viewed almost entirely through an anachronistic lens of stigma. That Irish people, unless their lives are directly affected by HIV, know this virus exclusively in terms of a terrifying punishment linked with sexual shame and bodily taboo, and most crucially, as a route to early, in some instances, well-deserved death. When Helen finds her mother at her offices, which she is shocked to discover are so expensive and modern, a modern woman is something that Lily is not in her views on homosexuality. Declan never says the words that he is gay to his mother or grandmother, and his mother must ask his doctor if he is gay. Helen avoids telling her mother about Declan's diagnosis for as long as she can, displaying a fear of her mother's reaction, her own discomfort about it, and the taboo surrounding having AIDS. When they arrive at the hospital and Lily speaks to the consultant alone, she thinks, quote, she knew that what her mother was asking, the question she had refrained from asking Helen in the car. She had always wondered if her mother knew about Declan being gay, and was not sure whether the consultant would tell her or not. But as she watched her mother walking out of the consultant's office and coming with her down the corridor, she knew that she had received a reply. Her mother's shoulders were hunched, and she kept her eyes on the ground. It was years since Helen had seen her look defeated like this, end quote. This is the moment Lily realizes that her son is gay, though she tries her best, because it is her son, and tells him, quote, Helen said that on the way up that you were worried about how I'd react. Well, you needn't worry about that at all. You and Helen are the two people I care about most, and nothing would ever change that, end quote. Though her motherly love seems to overcome her contempt for his sexuality, her true feelings on the subject shine through when speaking about Declan's friends and their sexuality. She refers to Declan having friends like Paul, and when Helen asks her to elaborate on what she means, her mother, irritated, replied, you know like what? Lily tells Helen, quote, there must be people who led him astray. I wonder where they are now. When Declan left my house, he was a young man anyone would be proud of, end quote, suggesting that it is not okay to be proud of a gay man. Quote, your grandmother told me that one of them gave a very vulgar account of himself. He's lucky I was in the other room. I would have run him out of here, end quote. When communities such as Catholic Ireland assume that, quote, the behaviors they associate with LGBT identities are sinful, shame may seem like an appropriate emotion, the way shame over alcoholism or the temptation to cheat on one's spouse can inspire better behavior and a redeemed identity. But the data collected by Toibin and Moon suggests that shame does not help fix sexual orientation and gender variance the way it works for sins such as theft or lying. Rather than helping to restore relationships, shame directed at these aspects of a person targets their ability to have relationships in the first place, end quote, either for fear of the reaction of family members or for the reactions they do receive when coming out. Quote, AIDS victims, many of them gays, had to build up alternative families since they were too scared or ashamed, end quote. The depiction of the love, acceptance, and companionship formed between Declan, Paul, and Larry points to the limitations of the nuclear family, which was heavily encouraged by the church, as it is shown when considering shame in Ireland. When such fear of contagion, a fear of reducing the things one fought for, home and family, and a religious fear produced homophobia, as George Weinberg theorized. The family begins to be used as a rhetorical weapon against the normalization of homosexuality. The patriarchal and heteronormative family is understood here as a moral principle of order and justice that must be protected from the immoral behavior of homosexuals. In Ireland's case, homophobia has partly derived from the great political and moral authority that the church exercised for most of the 20th century. Because of stigma stemming from AIDS and their sexuality, many gay men diagnosed with AIDS would lean on members of their gay community rather than their own family, as Declan is choosing to do. Matthew tells us that this displacement would occasionally lead to a conflict when mothers and sisters attempted to adopt their traditional role as caregivers, a role that had been overwhelmingly positioned as a feminine attribute in culture and the media, only to find they had been replaced by the patient's male friends, further disrupting the culture's view of the nuclear family. Declan has replaced his biological family with his chosen gay family, and the Blackwater Lightship depicts him attempting to reconcile the two and face his shame. Helen realizes that Declan has replaced his family with his friends. She wished he had thought of her as a friend. Helen may be first to understand why Declan would choose to replace his family with friends, as she too has deep emotional issues with her mother. Their mother, quote, seems to be guarding the room, keeping his evil friends away from him, end quote, because she sees them as bad influences, is jealous of their relationship with Declan, and displays her disdain for their sexuality. Though because she is Declan's mother, she would not fully express her feelings about him while he is dying. At one point, Paul tells Lily, quote, we have, Larry more than me, the two of us been looking after him during very difficult times, when I didn't notice his family around. And Lily responds, we aren't around because we were told nothing. Paul has no sympathy for this excuse and says, I wonder why you were told nothing. Maybe you could ponder that instead of getting in the way and making pointless arguments. Because I'm here because he asked me to be here. When he asked me to be here, he used words and phrases and sentences about you that were not edifying and which I will not repeat. He also is concerned about you and loves you and wants your approval, end quote, pointing to the troubled relationship between the two that is not as direct as Helen's contempt for Lily, but present nonetheless. Key to understanding the fractured relationships between Lily and her children is Kaufman's theory of interpersonal bridges. Though Kaufman agrees that shame is present when the positive affects of joy or interest are partially depleted but not completely, a third way of shame occurring is through the breaking of interpersonal bridges or relationships. Though shame signals this desire to withdraw, it simultaneously indicates a longing for acceptance and love, and to reconstitute this interpersonal bridge. The interpersonal bridge that a child forms with their parent is through interpersonal scenes, which establish emotional ties, the vital bonds that span the gulf between a strange infant and mother and later father, drawing them securely together. An interpersonal bridge forms out of reciprocal interest and shared experiences of trust. When the interpersonal bridge breaks, it activates shame. The interpersonal bridge can be restored if when one has behaved insensitively or reacted badly and has therefore activated shame in someone, loved or valued, all that is required in reapproaching the other is to openly, honestly acknowledge one's part. This will release the other's shame. Kaufman's developmental theory of shame diagrams that shame can lead to withdrawal of the person, and the suppression of this affect results in backed up affect and endocrine changes. This in turn leads to stress, and the consequences of this can include violence, suicide, psychosomatic illness, abuse, and addiction. Both Declan and Helen experienced blows to their interpersonal bridges with their mother and father at the time of his death. Helen's interpersonal bridge with her mother never recovers, leading to their distant relationship, which we learn about through Helen's flashbacks and conversations with Paul. Declan, however, does not seem to have been as severely affected by the breaking of the interpersonal bridge, but his refusal to come out to his mother until he is on his deathbed and avoidance of her throughout his adult years points to his fear of her acceptance of his lifestyle and sexuality, leading to a possible break in their relationship. When their father died of cancer during their childhood and their mother's subsequent absence from their life period of time, it left them with feelings of powerlessness, grief, and shame. Death is a potential activator of stress and shame, as is relationship loss. We have typically viewed death principally in the context of grief. Although grief is obviously present, shame is no less so, only more hidden from view. The amount of shame or any other affect felt after death and the resulting feelings of powerlessness is dependent on if a person has a dominance of one or more affects within the personality, the prevalence of shame itself, and emergent strategies of avoidance and escape from shame. Triggering the memory of the breaking of her interpersonal bridge with her mother when sleeping at her grandmother's house, Helen remembers when her mother told her, "Helen, your father is going to have to go to Dublin for tests." In any case, it was the last memory she had ever had of seeing her father. The smell of her grandmother's house and lying awake in bed, the bed that she had stayed in during that traumatic and powerless time in her life, and experiencing death of her immediate family member once again, and is powerless to the incurable illness her brother has. Helen thought, quote, years afterwards, she realized that her childhood ended in those few weeks, even though she did not have her first period until 6 months later, end quote. She is very matter-of-fact when describing her father's death as, quote, their father died on Dublin, 11th of June, illustrating the distancing that had occurred in those months of separation. After his death, she laid on his bed with his clothing as if he were a person, and is ashamed that someone would find her this way, even though this is the only way she could be with him again, and a way of saying goodbye, because she was robbed of this experience, and it has left her with abandonment issues, as seen with her relationship with husband Hugh. Helen attempts to speak to her mother about her resentment of the way she handled her father's death, and said, quote, when Helen looked again, her mother's eyes were cast down in shame. Shame is a loss of face. Blushing, lowering of the head, avoiding eye contact, and attempting to be invisible are all physiological signs of shame. This is because shame makes a person face conscious, as they are self-conscious, and lowering the head and eyes in shame will reduce the further exploration of what is causing interest or joy. Her mother tells her that after her father died, quote, I could never get you close to me. I came home and noticed at first at the funeral that you wouldn't meet my eyes. To which Helen responds, Declan and I felt abandoned, and I've never trusted you again. That's all. Helen speaks the exact words that Kaufman claims can fracture the interpersonal bridge between parent and child, trust and lack of interest, which in this case was abandoning them for months on end without letting them say goodbye to their father or writing and telephoning them. Lily herself admits to feeling shame in the aftermath of her husband dying. It's, quote, "It's hard to talk about. Coming home like that from Dublin and your father so young and everybody looking and watching. There was a sort of shame about it. It sounds mad, doesn't it? I know it does, but that's what it felt like. So exposed, or maybe that isn't the word, but it felt like shame. Those days after he died when we came home," end quote. By admitting that Lily had her own shame to deal with, she probably did neglect her children's feelings, as Helen describes, an environment filled with shame merely perpetuated by the experience of shame for all. It is clear to the reader that Declan wished his mother to be the one caring for him. Declan was constantly seeking the love and acceptance of his mother, pointing to their interpersonal bridge being broken, and him seeking to repair it. Paul tells Helen that Declan, quote, "would crawl to the bottom of their bed. He was like a small boy, and he'd talk and doze and play with our feet," end quote. Larry told Helen and her grandmother, quote, "Declan drove to Wexford a few times, to his mother's house, but it was always late and he never went in. I think he hoped she'd find him there, like Granny did. But he never saw her, and then he'd drive back to Dublin," end quote. He finally got the courage to inadvertently tell her that he was gay, and, quote, "I think he was so afraid that your mother would refuse to see him or something." The relief that she knows he is gay and did not refuse him, but is helping him in every way she can, is more than a relief to him. Because of his shame, quote, "I think he desperately wanted her to know and to help him, and yet he couldn't tell her. And now that he's told her, and he has her there, and she's trying to help him," end quote. The last few lines we hear Declan speak are, quote, "I wish it was over," and crying, "Mammy, Mammy, help me, Mammy," end quote. Though we never experienced Declan's death, there is a peace to this moment when Declan receives the love and acceptance he has sought from his mother. Though we know her attitudes about homosexuality are not of complete tolerance because of the way she treats his friends, she has repaired the relationship between Declan and herself and is attempting to make amends with Helen as well. There is a monumental difference in the coming out tales of the three characters in the Blackwater Lightship. The expression coming is to proclaim oneself as openly gay, is to come out of shame profoundly, to break the silence, making it a shame metaphor. Declan's coming out story is truly unfolding before our eyes, as we never learn more about his coming out to Helen other than her mentioning that she had known her for around 10 years, and he never directly says the words to his mother or grandmother, as far as we learn. However, Larry tells us his story in the literal dark, and quickly stops speaking when the lights come on. His story contains a very religious mother and father, quote, "nice, normal people," end quote, in Ireland, who he only told for fear that they would find out through the television, and that they do not speak of it. His mother told him that he would, quote, "always be her son no matter what I did. But I was to get back in the car this minute and go back to Dublin, and she would deal with my father, and she would phone me later on. She couldn't wait to get me out of the house. She was all pale and worried looking. I think she would have been happier if I had been in the IRA," end quote. These are not reassuring actions, but they did not disown him, they merely avoided it. She reacted in a way that assured him that she couldn't wait to get him out of the house. Shame is an emotion that makes a person wish to hide, to not be seen. It is an affect of avoidance and wishing for a lack of audience to witness their humiliation. By acting in this way, it could have only increased the shame of her son, as he sensed her shame and wished for him to disappear. Shame again is the reduction, but not complete disappearance of interest or joy, and he is both interested in and seeking the approval of his mother, who has rejected him. This is also encroaching into the interpersonal bridge between mother and son, but regarding the way he speaks of her, we can assume that they have somewhat repaired this bond and not completely severed their relationship, though this encounter was enough to cause severe shame. By Larry saying, when finishing recounting the story, quote, "funny, it's easier to talk like this in the dark, like going to confession, except there's no lighthouse in a confession box," end quote. He is pointing toward his shame because it is easier to speak if there is no audience to watch him repeat the shaming episode. The mention of a Catholic sacrament not only reminds us of the culture and upbringing and the lack of acceptance he has from the church he was raised in because of his sinning. The lighthouse, the stronger lighthouse that has not been taken out of commission, reminds us that he is of the weaker dichotomy of homosexual and heterosexual, the feminine being of Brennan's affect theory that will be the scapegoat of negative affects during his lifetime. Lily was not present for this revelation and asks why they were in the dark when she barges in after the story is over. As Larry came out of his shame and told his story in the dark, the light brings us back to Lily, who was the last to know Declan was gay and who was not present to hear Larry's story either. The least progressive of the family in many ways. Lily seems to struggle the most with accepting Declan's chosen family, though their grandmother may act like she is progressive. She may have also wished she was in the dark, as she later relays, quote, "Oh, Helen, when I thought about it afterwards, I imagined your grandfather and things like that being said in this room," end quote. Paul's coming out story is much different from Declan and Larry's, as he not only feels that he came out in Ireland, but France as well, illustrating the differences between the two countries, though both have Catholic backgrounds. Paul's significant other is French, and they live in Brussels together when Paul is not taking care of Declan. Helen wishes to ask Paul about the history of his relationship with his significant other, but is too uncomfortable to do so and fails to complete her sentences. When speaking of the cultural differences between Ireland and a country on the continent, Paul says, quote, "The way all of us, I mean Irish boys, the way we dealt with each other puzzled the French people, but I didn't realize that until much later. We were all surprised at how they shook hands with each other and kissed each other off all the time. Looking back on it, that was, I suppose, how we communicated. While in France, he, quote, loved how straightforward they all were, end quote. There was not the hiding of emotions and physical touch between the same sex. There was no outward shame shown because of this. The heterosexuals in this case were pushing their negative affects onto the other, the feminine, the homosexual. While he was afraid to come out to his parents, when they told his significant other, Francois's parents, they were just, quote, unbelievable. They bought a big double bed for us and put it in Francois's room. I don't think he had a single moment's problem with them about being gay," end quote. Yeber wrote that, quote, "Declan also participated of this fresh air and gay-friendly atmosphere in the continent. However, his diseased body must come back to Ireland as an allegory of sin and punishment. Declan's body can thus be read as the site of repression, as the casualty of the Irish modernization process. Like Christ, he is a victim born and dead for his people to metaphorically come to terms with the past and hence open up to the future," end quote. Comparing Declan to Christ points to the treatment of Declan as the other, the unaccepted, and the persecuted, which homosexuals often have been. He also shows that Declan, and also Paul and Francois, were accepted on the continent in a way that they were not in Ireland, as shown through the differences in their coming out stories based on the country. Ireland was still culturally very Catholic, and as we mentioned earlier, acting on homosexuality is against Catholic tradition. As Ireland moved toward modernization in the 1990s on, homosexuality, at least in the legislative sense, has become more accepted. But this novel was a great example of the repression and lack of tolerance and negative affects faced by gay men. Why would then Declan return to Ireland if his life as a gay man was much better off the island? A return to rural setting, a return to coexistence of an individual, his oneness with his mother, as we saw in the section on mothering in the Blackwater Lightship. Declan wishing for nothing more than acceptance and love from his mother, a healing of their relationship and their interpersonal bridge. He had no choice but to merge his two worlds, his gay family, where he was out and proud, and his biological family, who he was ashamed to tell he was gay, if he wished to die in peace. The choice to have the rocks of bond sang at the beginning of the novel is telling, as it is a lament about the forced movement of the Catholic ploughmen by Cromwell from their land to the Western Ireland, where the land was hard and barren. Even joining the British Army offered better prospects for the ploughmen. The lament is truly about the struggle of these men. Declan, in this case, would move to the continent and have a better life, but in this way he would be forced out. He could also choose to stay in Ireland and tirelessly struggle for the rest of his life. After Francois's parents died in this terrible accident, both of us were part of a group of Catholic gay men in Brussels who met on a Wednesday night. Declan used to fall about laughing at the idea, and even more so when we told him some of the things that were said. He used to call it cruising for Christ, said Paul. Quote, "I asked one of them if there was a priest in Brussels or anywhere that would bless us. And when they met one, he asked them things like, when was the last time I had gone to confession? I said it was years. In communion, I said it was a long time," end quote. We learned that his Catholic faith is close to his heart, but his attempt to go to a Catholic gay men's group, and the fact that Paul goes to Mass later in the book. Yet even though he respects the sacraments by not going to communion if he is not in a state of grace, by not being celibate, he avoided confession and decides to become married when it is offered, though he originally sought a blessing. According to the Catholic Church, marriage is between a man and a woman, but the priest in Brussels told Paul and Francois he would do it on 3 conditions. 1, that we made good confessions before the ceremony, 2, that we went to Mass every Sunday for a year, and 3, that we told no one. They told him that they could not agree to the final condition, as they wished to tell Declan and Paul's sister, and now Paul told Helen. When conducting the ceremony, the priest used the word spouse instead of husband and wife. And when they had finished the feast he provided after the marriage ceremony, the priest announced, quote, "Welcome to the Catholic Church," end quote. Helen states that this does not bother her, but later says, quote, "Does the Pope know much about him?" referring to the priest, and Paul responds angrily that he was sorry he had told her his story, and quote, "It's amazing that people like you were let up bring children, and that's why I left this country," remarks like that. French people, even Belgian people, never talk like that, end quote, again remarking on the difference between the reception and tolerance of homosexuality on the continent versus Ireland. Paul lashes out again about his true feelings on Irish people when saying, quote, "One of the reasons I left Ireland was to get away from sniping and sneering and cheap stupidity," end quote. His direct commentary on the people of Ireland shows his disdain for intolerance of homosexuality by the people there, but also shows that Helen is not as accepting as she would like to think she is when lecturing her mother and grandmother. Depicting how Catholic Ireland remained, specifically in a rural setting, Helen, her grandmother, Lily, and Paul went to Blackwater for Mass. Significantly, their grandmother again is hesitant to be in public with Paul for fear of her community will learn of his sexuality, his relationship to Declan, and Declan's illness. Helen remarks on the Catholic culture of Blackwater, quote, "She had forgotten the scene at 11 o'clock Mass. The women in headscarves or fancy hats on one side of the church, the men on the other side in suits, even the young boys in suits, the sense of awe and unease in every face, the silence, the watchfulness, the soft, old-fashioned edge to everything. The respect and conformity was broken only by visitors, people from Dublin or from towns who walked up to the church and sat together as a family and wore summer holiday clothes," end quote. Sitting on separate sides of the church, separating men from women, covering of female heads, and the sense of unease in every face depicts a very old-fashioned Catholic culture within the area. Helen says that she feels uncomfortable for not covering her head, an act that is indeed an act of shame, to hide and cover oneself, as culture tells women that they are to be ashamed of the attention their body can cause. She also did not go to communion, but the other three did. This is an important detail, as although he went to a Catholic men's group and sought out a priest to bless his relationship with Francois, Paul told the priest that he no longer went to communion or confession. The priest's acceptance of Francois and Paul is key in their release of shame. Paul was invested in his religion and sought to be still connected with the Catholic Church, but felt rejected because of his lifestyle and was condemned because his lifestyle was condemned to sin and shameful. However, when the priest announced to him following his marriage that he was welcomed again into the Catholic Church, the acceptance he had longed for, the love, and to reconstitute this interpersonal bridge, the connection and emotional tie that he felt with his relationship to his faith, and this moment of acceptance and welcoming released his shame. And this is expressed when he goes to communion. All right.
Wow.
Oops.
Carleigh, are you there?
Yes, sorry, I'm trying to come back, but
No, what?
let's see.
Do you want to stop the recording?
Yes, I'm trying. Let's see. All right, we've stopped recording.